February 17, 1943, London. The rain came down in thin, gray sheets, blurring the lamps outside the War Office. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker than smoke. Generals in khaki stood around a long oak table covered in blueprints and sketches. Every few seconds, someone coughed or muttered. On the far end of the room, a man in a rumpled uniform leaned over a pile of drawings. His name was Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart's funnies, they would call them later. But tonight, most of the men in that room thought he'd gone completely mad. "Gentlemen," Hobart said, his eyes shining behind wire-rimmed glasses, "these are not fantasies. These are solutions. Tanks that swim, tanks that breathe, tanks that can cross beaches under fire and turn obstacles into rubble." One of the officers snorted. "And perhaps they'll sprout wings next, Hobart. We're fighting a war, not a circus." Laughter rippled through the room. Hobart didn't flinch. He simply pointed to the diagram of a strange machine, a Churchill tank with a giant rotating drum covered in flailing chains. "This," he said, topping the paper, "will clear mines. It doesn't rely on men crawling in the dirt with bayonets. It beats the ground into submission. It detonates every mine in its path and keeps rolling." The room fell quiet. Another general frowned. "And you expect soldiers to drive that thing? It'll shake them to pieces." Hobart smiled faintly. "Better shaken than buried." Silence again. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. For months, Hobart had been pushing his radical designs. Flame-throwing tanks, bridge-laying tanks, tanks that fired mortars sideways or inflated into floating machines. But most of all, he believed in the flail, a rotating cylinder powered by chains that could strike the earth fast enough to trigger hidden mines before the tank passed over them. His ideas sounded insane. Even Churchill's advisors called it impractical. But the Prime Minister saw something the others didn't. Winston Churchill had a soft spot for brilliant misfits, and Hobart was exactly that. In 1940, the British Army had forced him into retirement, calling his theories unconventional. By 1941, Churchill personally recalled him to service with a note that simply read, "We need results, not respectability." And so Hobart returned, older, angrier, and ready to prove them all wrong. In a cold workshop on the outskirts of Yorkshire, Hobart gathered a handful of eccentric engineers, mechanics, and tank crews. They worked in a place called the 79th Armored Division, a unit so secret that most British soldiers didn't even know it existed. It wasn't a fighting division. It was a laboratory of war. One night, as the snow fell outside, Hobart stood beside a prototype Churchill tank with a massive drum on its front. Dozens of heavy chains hung from it, clinking in the wind. "Are you serious about spinning that thing up?" a sergeant asked. Hobart nodded. "If we're lucky, it won't blow the tank apart." The sergeant sighed. "And if we're not lucky?" Hobart looked up at the dark sky. "Then they'll learn something valuable." They tested it at dawn. The air was freezing. The men stood behind sandbags, holding their breath, as the tank's engine roared to life. The chains began to spin, slow at first, then faster, until they blurred into a storm of steel. The ground in front of the tank turned into chaos, dust, dirt, and debris flying in all directions. Then came the first explosion. A dull thud beneath the earth, then another, and another. The flail kept spinning, clearing a path through a simulated minefield. When the dust settled, there was a wide strip of safe ground leading straight through what had been a deadly trap. Hobart grinned. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "that's
progress. But the next test wasn't so lucky. One of the flail chains snapped and tore through the tank's side armor, killing a crewman instantly. Another time, the gearbox caught fire. On the third attempt, the entire drum detached and bounced 50 yards across the field. Every time, Hobart made notes. He didn't scold or despair. He just adjusted, rebuilt, improved. His obsession was relentless. By the spring of 1943, the Scorpion, as his men nicknamed it, was terrifying to look at, but effective. Churchill visited the test range in May. The old bulldog stood beside Hobart, umbrella in one hand, cigar in the other, watching the flail tank churn up the ground like a mechanical beast. After it detonated a line of dummy mines, Churchill puffed his cigar thoughtfully. "So, this contraption, you're confident it can clear a real minefield?" Hobart didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, and faster than any sapper alive." Churchill smiled. "Then you'll have your chance soon enough. The next war will be won by the man who can bring tanks ashore, not just build them." The invasion of Europe was already being planned. The operation that would later be called Overlord. Everyone knew the beaches would be mined to hell and back. Barbed wire, obstacles, anti-tank ditches. German defenses were meticulous. Any normal advance would be suicide. But Hobart's machines, his funnies, might change that. By the end of 1943, his division was filled with the strangest collection of vehicles ever built. The Churchill Crocodile, which spat liquid fire from a hidden trailer. The Ave, which carried giant mortar rounds capable of smashing concrete bunkers. The bridge-laying tank, which could unfold a steel path over rivers or trenches in under a minute. And of course, the flail, now officially called the Sherman Crab. It was hideous and magnificent at the same time. A Sherman tank fitted with a huge rotating drum and dozens of heavy chains that whipped the earth like fury. It could move at walking speed, beating the ground ahead of it, detonating mines before the tank's tracks ever touched them. The first crews that saw it were terrified. They called it the Beast. When it spun up, the noise was deafening, a mixture of engine roar and metallic thunder that echoed for miles. Training began in early 1944. On the training grounds near Suffolk, Hobart's men drove the machines across fake beaches under simulated gunfire. They learned to coordinate timing, to keep distance between vehicles, to follow precisely in the flail's cleared path. Every mistake meant a mock explosion, or worse, a real one. Sergeant Robert McAllister, one of the first flail operators, described the experience years later. "It was like driving into hell with your eyes open. The ground shaking, the chains hammering, dust everywhere. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but you just kept going, because if you stopped, you died." By June 1944, everything was ready. The Allies were preparing to storm Normandy. The Germans expected a slaughter. They'd spent months turning the beaches into killing zones. Tens of thousands of mines lay buried under the sand. Any tank advance would be shredded before it even began.
But Hobart had other plans. He was given command of the 79th Armored Division with orders to deploy his funnies on D-Day. Many American commanders refused to use them, calling them too complicated. The British, however, trusted Hobart. They knew his reputation for stubborn brilliance. So, as the invasion fleet assembled in the English Channel, a handful of strange tanks sat below deck, each fitted with bizarre attachments, each crewed by men who knew they were about to make history or die trying. June 5, 1944, night. Aboard one of the landing craft bound for Normandy, Sergeant McAllister sat beside his flail tank, listening to the chains rattle softly as the ship rocked.
His hands trembled, but his voice was steady when he spoke to the new recruit beside him. "Listen, kid," he said. "When that ramp drops, we don't wait. We start the engine, spin the drum, and drive. Doesn't matter what's in front of us. Mines, wire, dead bodies, we clear it. Understand?" The young man nodded, pale and wide-eyed. McAllister forced a grin. "Good. Welcome to Hobart's circus." Out on the deck, Hobart himself stood under the dim red light of the invasion ships, watching the horizon. He was 59 years old now, gray-haired, weary, but his mind was sharper than ever. He looked toward France. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark waves, lay the beaches of Normandy. "They called us mad. Let's give them a show worth remembering." At 6:30 a.m., June 6, 1944, the first wave of British troops landed at Sword and Juno beaches. German artillery opened up immediately, turning the shore into a storm of fire. Machine guns tore into the surf. Men fell everywhere. And then the funny tanks appeared. The flail tanks rolled down the ramps into the water, chains clattering, engines roaring. The noise was monstrous, like thunder made of iron. They drove straight onto the mined beaches and began to spin. Each explosion cleared another patch of sand. Within minutes, the flails had carved safe lanes through the minefields, wide enough for entire columns of tanks and infantry to pass. From German bunkers, soldiers stared in disbelief. They'd expected to watch British armor burn. Instead, they saw tanks driving calmly through explosions, kicking up sand and smoke, and never stopping. A captured German officer later wrote, "We thought they had gone mad. No human would drive into a minefield willingly, but they did, and they lived." As more flails advanced, other funny tanks followed, bridge layers crossing ditches, flamethrowers clearing bunkers, Avery tanks blasting through concrete walls. The beach defenses that had taken years to build were collapsing in hours. When the dust settled by noon, reports came back. 90% of the British sector's minefields had been cleared without a single tank crew lost to mines, not one. Hobart's inventions had done the impossible. And yet back in London, some officers still couldn't believe it. "Pure luck," one of them said. "Those contraptions will never work twice." But on the beaches of Normandy, men like McAllister knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It was genius, born out of madness. That evening, as the sky darkened and the sea turned red with sunset and blood, McAllister's crew parked their flail tank near a destroyed bunker. The chains hung limp, covered in sand and soot. One of the men climbed out, grinning through exhaustion. "Crazy old bastard," he muttered, looking toward the horizon. He actually pulled it off. Back on his command ship, Hobart received the radio message confirming the results. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded once, quietly satisfied. Then he took off his glasses, wiped the salt spray from them, and whispered, "Never tell me it can't be done." He turned to face the map of France on the wall. For the first time, the door to Europe was open, cleared not only by courage, but by a handful of crazy ideas that had turned into steel. And the man who'd once been called mad now stood vindicated as the most unorthodox general of the Second World War. June 10, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were still smoking. The air smelled of diesel, blood, and salt. Broken landing craft littered the surf. Yet among the wreckage, British engineers were already at work, extending the cleared lanes, expanding the bridgeheads, and moving deeper inland. Everywhere the men looked, they saw Hobart's machines. Flail tanks grinding across the sand, bridge layers unfolding their metal spines over flooded trenches. Crocodile flamethrowers reducing German bunkers into blackened craters. To the German soldiers, it seemed like the British had unleashed an army of mechanical monsters. In one captured German report from a German officer defending near Ouistreham, He described the scene in disbelief. Our mines detonated continuously, yet the tanks advanced unharmed. They were covered in chains and iron spikes, like beasts from a nightmare. We fired everything we had. Nothing stopped them. Back on the British side, the legend of Hobart's funny tanks spread fast. Troops who had once joked about his inventions now spoke of them with awe. The flail tanks were no longer Hobart's circus, they were lifesavers. Sergeant Robert McAllister, who had survived Sword Beach, stood beside his Sherman Crab 2 days later, staring at the shredded chains. More than half were bent or broken from explosions. He rested his hand on the scorched armor. "You got us through, old girl. You bloody well did." As reinforcements poured in, Hobart himself landed in Normandy. He arrived not in a jeep or command car, but in a modified tank fitted with extra armor plates. He refused to stand back from the front. "How can I ask men to risk their lives in machines I won't ride myself?" he said. His arrival drew attention. Mud-splattered soldiers saluted as the mad general passed by, his face calm but his eyes sharp behind the dust-smeared goggles. Wherever he went, morale lifted. Hobart inspected the mine-cleared zones, walking beside the flail operators who had led the first waves. He asked about mechanical issues, timing delays, and damage patterns. He took notes on every answer. He didn't care for medals or speeches. He wanted improvement. That night, as the campfires flickered across the beachhead, Hobart gathered his engineers under a torn canvas tent. Maps and blueprints were spread across a crate. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've proved it works. Now we make it better. The war isn't won yet." One of the engineers, Captain Adams, spoke up. "Sir, we lost 3 flails to broken chains. The spares won't hold." Hobart didn't look up from his notes. "Then forge new ones from tank treads if you must. Adapt." Another officer hesitated. "The Americans still won't use them, sir. They say our designs are too unreliable."
Hobart chuckled softly. "They'll come around. War has a way of humbling the skeptical." Meanwhile, across the channel, American generals were taking notice. Photos of British funny tanks clearing beaches reached Allied command within days. Eisenhower himself saw the reports and reportedly muttered, "We should have borrowed Hobart." Indeed, many American units had refused the British offer to share their modified tanks before the invasion. Some American beaches, like Omaha, suffered terrible losses because they lacked mine-clearing flails and specialized armor. Now, commanders were quietly asking for demonstrations. By July 1944, Hobart's reputation had transformed from eccentric dreamer to visionary engineer. Yet he never softened. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I take no pleasure in being right, only in seeing men live because someone once called me mad." As the British advanced through Normandy, the flails led the way through field after field of mines. In one engagement near Caen, a column of infantry refused to move forward because they believed the area ahead was mined. Hobart's tank crews rolled up, spinning their chains. Explosion after explosion erupted, 30 in all, and when the smoke cleared, the path was safe. The infantry followed, stunned. Not a single casualty. Word of such feats spread fast. German prisoners began calling the flail tanks Der Teufel mit Ketten, the devil with chains. But even devils had their limits. The flails required constant maintenance. Chains snapped, drums jammed, and in wet conditions, the heavy tanks often bogged down in mud. Hobart pushed for new solutions. He summoned his engineers to create modifications for every terrain, from wet clay to concrete roads. By late summer, they had developed reinforced links, quick replacement systems, and even flail variants that could attach to other tank models. Each improvement saved lives. Meanwhile, in Germany, alarm was spreading through the high command. Reports from the Western Front described British assault vehicles capable of breaching any defensive system.
Some German officers dismissed it as exaggeration, but others, like Field Marshal Rommel, knew better. Rommel had seen the effects of technological surprise before. He recognized the danger. In one intercepted message to Berlin, he warned, "If the British continue employing these mechanical devices with such coordination, our static defenses will crumble, the beaches will not hold." Rommel was right. By August 1944, Hobart's funnies were moving inland with the main British forces. Wherever German defenses stood, they were systematically dismantled. Minefields vanished in hours. Anti-tank walls were destroyed by specialized Aver mortars. River crossings that should have delayed divisions for days were completed in minutes thanks to bridge-laying tanks. Hobart's machines didn't just win battles, they changed the tempo of the war. The Allies advanced faster than German planners believed possible. Commanders began to joke that the British Army had turned war into an engineering project. "We no longer fight the terrain, we remodel it," one officer said. Still, not everyone admired Hobart. Some traditionalists in the British High Command grumbled that his obsession with gadgets distracted from real soldiering. When news reached him, Hobart responded dryly, "Real soldiers are the ones still alive when the shooting stops." His soldiers loved him for that. In September 1944, the British Army prepared for a new challenge, clearing the heavily fortified Channel ports. German engineers had filled both approaches with dense mine belts and reinforced bunkers. Without Hobart's designs, a direct assault would have cost thousands of lives. The 79th Armored Division was called in again. At dawn, under low clouds, the flails rolled forward, drums spinning. Explosions rippled across the landscape like heartbeat pulses. Behind them came the Aver tanks, lobbing massive demolition rounds into concrete pillboxes. Bridges unfolded across craters as infantry followed. Within hours, what had been considered impregnable was reduced to ruins. Prisoners later told interrogators that German defenders had simply panicked when they saw the strange tanks coming. "We had no weapon to stop them. We fired and fired, but they did not stop. The ground itself fought for the British." That line, "The ground itself fought for the British," would later appear in a field report circulated across Allied command. It became the unofficial motto of the 79th Armored Division. Hobart rarely smiled, but when he read that report, witnesses said he allowed himself a single quiet chuckle. Throughout late 1944, as the Allies pushed into Belgium and Holland, Hobart continued refining his machines. New variants emerged, amphibious tanks, bridge layers with extendable spans, and even rolling demolition platforms. The British press caught wind of his exploits and nicknamed him the Inventor General. But to the men in the field, he was still Hobo, the mad genius. By December, the war had entered its most brutal winter. Snow covered the roads, ice froze the rivers, and the Ardennes offensive raged to the south. Yet even then, Hobart's tanks kept moving. At times, the flails were used not just for mines, but to break through frozen debris in wire fields. On Christmas Eve 1944, Hobart visited a forward base near the Dutch border. A group of weary flail operators stood around a fire trying to thaw their frozen gloves. He walked up quietly, hands behind his back. "Evening, lads," he said. They scrambled to attention, but he waved them off. "At ease. I'm not here for ceremony." I look at their soot-streaked faces and the battered tanks parked behind them. "You've done more for this war than most people will ever know," he said softly. "Every field you clear saves lives. Every mine you detonate is a victory." One of the men grinned. "Aye, sir, though my back says otherwise." Hobart laughed, a rare, genuine laugh. "War isn't comfortable, Sergeant, but you're proving it can be survivable." The next morning, a courier brought news from London. The War Office was recommending Hobart for a knighthood. The letter called him the father of modern combat engineering. Hobart read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket. "Tell them," he said, "I'll accept when the war is over. For now there's work to do." And there was plenty. As 1945 began, Hobart's 79th Armored Division prepared for the crossing of the Rhine, Germany's final natural barrier. The Germans had mined both banks heavily, turning them into death traps. The plan to cross would depend entirely on Hobart's flails and bridge layers. By now, his machines were operating with surgical precision. Each flail cleared a 15-foot-wide path in under 10 minutes. Each bridge layer deployed its span in 90 seconds flat. When the operation began in March, British armor stormed across the Rhine with minimal losses. Observers reported seeing German mines exploding harmlessly beneath the flails as the tanks rolled forward. Within hours, the Allies had a firm bridgehead on the eastern bank. In Berlin, the High Command received the news with disbelief. "Their tanks defy logic," one report stated. "No defensive minefield remains effective." That statement was true. Across the Western Front, Hobart's inventions had neutralized 90% of all German minefields encountered by British forces, and done so without catastrophic losses. His designs were more than machines. They were proof that imagination could outfight fear. In April, as the war drew to its end, Hobart's men liberated towns and cleared roads for advancing columns. Villagers would come out to cheer the strange tanks with their spinning chains and steel arms. To them, they looked like dragons of liberation, loud, ugly, unstoppable.
When victory in Europe was finally declared on May 8, 1945, Hobart stood in silence at his headquarters. His staff cheered, drank, and laughed, but he remained at his desk, staring at the map of Europe. So many red circles, minefields once deadly, now meaningless. A junior officer approached. "Sir, the war's over. You've done it." Hobart smiled faintly. "No, Lieutenant, we did it. And maybe next time they'll call the mad ones first." June 6, 1944. The world was holding its breath. Off the coast of Normandy, the gray waters of the English Channel were choked with ships, thousands of them. Every kind of vessel ever built was now part of an armada that stretched beyond the horizon. The men aboard could barely see the water for all the steel around them. It was the dawn of D-Day, Operation Overlord, and among those ships, tucked between the landing craft and battleships, sat a strange collection of armored monsters. They looked nothing like tanks. Some had giant spinning drums instead of guns. Others had long snake-like hoses coiled across their hulls. A few had steel chains that clattered and thrashed in the wind. The soldiers looked at them and laughed nervously. They'd heard rumors about these machines, that they were Hobart's funnies, the mad inventions of some British general who'd supposedly lost his mind. Inside one of those vehicles, Major Peter Kinnear checked his stopwatch and shouted to his crew. The tank's engine roared, drowning his words, but they didn't need to hear him. They knew the plan. They'd practiced it 100 times. They were part of the 79th Armored Division, the crustaceans, as other units called them, because they always seemed to scuttle where no sane man would go. Their machines were Hobart's creation. The Sherman Crab, fitted with a rotating drum of flails, could clear minefields by beating the ground with heavy chains, detonating mines before they reached the tracks. It was absurdly simple. It was also terrifying. Every time those chains struck, the explosion shook the tank like a giant's fist. The crews joked that they were sitting inside a steel coffin designed by a lunatic. But Hobart believed in his lunacy. He had said it again and again. Innovation is the difference between slaughter and survival. And today, he was going to prove it. As dawn broke, the first landing craft hit the beaches. The ramps dropped and chaos erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the surf. Men stumbled into the water, dragging equipment, shouting for cover. The German defenses were worse than anyone imagined. Hidden bunkers, pre-sighted artillery, and worst of all, the minefields. The moment a British engineer unit stepped onto the sand, explosions erupted beneath their feet. The mine belts were thick, overlapping, impossible to cross without clearing them. For a moment, it looked like the invasion might stall. Then, through the smoke and chaos, came a sound that no one had ever heard before on a battlefield, a mechanical roar, followed by the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of chains whipping against the earth. The first Sherman crab rolled forward, its flail drum spinning at full speed. The chains struck the sand, detonating mines in bursts of black smoke. Each explosion shook the tank like a giant's fist, but the machine kept moving. The soldiers nearby stared in disbelief as the crab carved a clean, safe path through the killing zone. Behind it, infantry poured through, shouting and cheering. Farther down the beach, another of Hobart's inventions was at work, the Churchill ARVE, a massive assault vehicle armed with a spigot mortar nicknamed the Petard. Its job was to blow apart concrete bunkers and walls. The first one fired, and a 40-pound charge slammed into a German pillbox, ripping it open in a single blast. The defenders inside never had a chance. To the men on the ground, it felt like a miracle. Every problem that had seemed unsolvable just minutes before was being torn apart by these bizarre machines. Where there were obstacles, the ARVEs blasted them aside. Where there were flooded craters, the bobbins unrolled thick mats of canvas to give them traction. All across Sword and Juno beaches, Hobart's so-called funnies were turning the tide. In one sector, a Sherman crab led by Sergeant Ellis found themselves under direct artillery fire. Shells landed so close that the tank's hull rang like a bell. The flail drum was damaged, half the chains gone, but Ellis refused to stop. He pushed forward, clearing the last stretch of minefield that blocked the exit road. When infantry officers reached him minutes later, they found his tank still idling, the flail bent but working. The path behind him was clear, a 60-yard-wide corridor through what had been a death trap. By 9 a.m., most of the British and Canadian beaches were secure. Reports began to filter back to the command ships offshore. Casualties were heavy on Omaha Beach, where the Americans hadn't received the same special equipment. Their generals had rejected Hobart's inventions as too unorthodox. But on the British sectors, where the funnies led the way, minefield losses were almost non-existent.
In fact, out of the first 1,000 men to land behind the crab tanks, fewer than 10 were lost to mines. 90% of all minefields had been cleared within hours. Back on his command ship, Percy Hobart stood by the radio, listening to the reports. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from years of frustration suddenly vindicated. Every voice crackling through the static confirmed what he'd always believed, that imagination, not brute force, was the key to survival. A young staff officer approached him and said, "Sir, they're calling it a miracle." Hobart smiled faintly. "Not a miracle, son," he replied, "just engineering." As the day went on, the beaches filled with men, tanks, and supplies. The tide turned red with fuel and blood, but the beachhead held. Thanks to Hobart's strange inventions, the Germans were caught off guard. Their minefields, the same defenses they'd spent years perfecting, had been neutralized in a single morning. At a command post inland, a captured German officer watched the British tanks advance and muttered, "We thought them fools. Now I see they were clever devils." In the following days, Hobart's machines continued to shape the battlefield. When bridges collapsed, the AVREs laid fascines. Even in the dense bocage of Normandy, his engineers found ways to adapt, turning impossible terrain into passable ground. The British soldiers who had once mocked the 79th Armored Division now begged for their support. Whenever they saw the crabs approaching, they cheered, shouting, "Here come the funnies!" For Hobart, it was the vindication of a lifetime. He had been ridiculed, sidelined, even forced into retirement once. Now his division was being credited with saving thousands of lives and securing the success of the greatest invasion in history. After the Normandy campaign, Allied commanders estimated that Hobart's specialized tanks had reduced minefield casualties by over 90% compared to earlier operations. What had once seemed insane had become doctrine. But Hobart himself didn't celebrate. He visited the beaches weeks later, walking among the wreckage, burned-out vehicles, shattered landing craft, and unmarked graves. He stopped beside a flail tank, its hull blackened by fire, and laid his hand on the twisted metal. The name Mabel was still visible under the soot. He knew the men who'd driven it. They hadn't survived. He whispered quietly, "You proved them all wrong." After the war, many of Hobart's inventions disappeared into storage or were scrapped, but the ideas lived on. In the mine-clearing tanks of Korea, in the bridge-laying vehicles of modern armies, and in the engineering divisions that now accompany every major military operation. In 1947, when Hobart retired for good, one of his former officers told him, "You changed the way we fight." Hobart only smiled and said, "No, I just changed the way we think." He died in 1957, largely forgotten outside military circles. But in the decades that followed, historians began to re-examine his legacy. They found that his crazy inventions had saved thousands of lives, shortened battles, and given the Allies a decisive edge. In the museums of Bobbington and Duxford today, a few of those strange machines still stand. The crabs, the AVREs, the bobbins. Visitors look at them and laugh at first, just like the soldiers once did. Then they read the plaques, the casualty statistics, the photographs of Normandy, and suddenly the laughter stops. Because they realize what Hobart saw all along, that sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones that work. When the veterans of the 79th Armored Division were asked years later what it was like to drive those machines into battle, one replied, "It was like sitting inside a thunderstorm. You could feel death all around you, but the old man's machines, they kept us alive. We were his proof." And that is how a British general, mocked as a madman, built the strangest tanks the world had ever seen and used them to clear 90% of German minefields without losing a single man. He didn't just win a battle. He changed the definition of courage, proving that genius doesn't always wear medals or march in step. Sometimes it just builds something so mad it saves the world.